Hey everyone, it's Michael GoosebumpsFan. I'm sorry for the weird lighting for this video. Apparently the sun just went away. It looks like it's going to try to rain today, again, after like 2 weeks of this. Anyway, today I have a Things Like Goosebumps video to talk about. I have kind of a new thing I want to talk about here soon. I'm going to make another video later on, maybe tonight, before I upload the Q&A video. I have a lot of videos coming out tonight. Before I do the Q&A video, I'm probably going to upload another video as well, kind of updating the Things Like Goosebumps idea. For what I consider a thing like Goosebumps, just because I want to help you guys out a little bit on what I'm looking at with that nowadays. But anyway, for this particular video, this is a straight-up review of a thing like Goosebumps that I loved. I talked about the first two books out of the trilogy. This is the third book from Stephen Gammell and Alvin Schwartz. Stephen Gammell doing the art, of course, for the best art ever for any kind of horror kids series. This is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, of course. The third book is called Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. And this is the cover. This is the newer hardcover that came out, the new Treasury, if you want to call it that, because it used to be called the Scary Stories Treasury. This is the new copy of that type of thing that came out around last year, I think, when the new movie came out, or the year before, somewhere in that aspect. But I love the movie. Talk about it nonstop. I've collected everything, including the pop figures that came out for the film. Both of those are signed, as a matter of fact, in my collection. So I'm loving some Scary Story stuff. It's probably my second favorite, if not my very favorite, Scary Stories series, aside from Goosebumps. Like, I would consider it like top tier precursor to Goosebumps. Scary stuff, man. Some really, really scary stuff. Alvin Schwartz, for anybody who doesn't know, if this happens to be the first video of mine you happen to watch, Alvin Schwartz was this famous guy, not really famous, but he's famous for these books and all the controversy they caused. Because he would go out and he's a big interest in folklore and all these other things. He would collect these stories from all over the world, basically, and he would compile them into these very short stories, and just like in here, that were like 3 to 5 pages long, sometimes shorter than that, maybe like a page sometimes. And they're always effective. Almost every single one is always effective. And I really love the first two books in a lot of ways. I think I love the first book more than the second. The third book I really love too. I think all of them are really, really, really good. I just adore them to death. I think there's so many good stories in here, so many creepy things that scared me to death when I was a kid. But the biggest thing for Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is that the illustrations, the original illustrations that are also in this book, that were originally replaced in like 2010, somewhere in that aspect, by Brian Helquist, the original art from Stephen Gammell is petrifying. And I'll show you some of the art in the book review thing if you want to, just because I want you to experience some of this too. I've done it in the previous two videos. I want to show you a little bit here as well. And I want to talk about like my favorite stories in the book and some of the biggest highlights for me as a fan of these stories from this third book specifically. Maybe I'll talk a little bit every once in a while about the previous two books sometimes, but mainly I want to talk about just this book like I did with the first two reviews. But I'll kind of go through some of the things from the contents section of the book. So the first story in here is called The Appointment, and I have always loved the art. I get just this weird Twilight Zone feeling when I look at the art of this particular story. But the story itself is like a half a page long, and it is so effective, man. Look at this art here with the Grim Reaper and the floating truck. I'm trying to figure out the best way I can possibly show that to you without destroying my book. Yeah, look at this. I wish I could paint like that. It's just beautiful, man. The Appointment is the story about this guy, this grandfather's grandson type kid, and he essentially wants to, he runs into death, like the Grim Reaper at one point, and decides to run away, and he takes his grandfather's car into the city. And the finale of that story, like the last paragraph, the last couple of paragraphs, are just amazing. I love that story. It's one of my favorite of the Scary Stories franchise. It's just so ingenious, and so well done, and so well executed for a short, scary story for kids. That story alone will provoke your entire thoughts about eternity, about life without Jesus Christ, all these things that just become so effective because of this one little story, a half a page, that makes you really think. It has such a good Twilight Zone feel to it. Again, they're not super in-depth, like a 25-minute episode of Twilight Zone, but still, it has a very Rod Serling feel to it. I feel like that was a big influence on the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books, because just of stories like that, it's just a really good mythological, mythy, folklore type thing that I really dig. Really, really works. Some of these stories I might be forgetting, but you know, some of them, if I don't talk about certain ones, that might be your favorite. Maybe I've just forgotten them. But it's been a couple of weeks now since I've read this book. About 2 weeks ago, I did a review for the first two books, and I forgot to do this one as well. Excuse me. Oh, that was bad. You ever sneeze so hard it makes it feel better? like kind of rocked your brain inside of your skull. That's what I feel like. Anyway, the next story I want to talk about is one that came to my mind looking over these story titles and looking back at the stories. Footsteps. Footsteps is a really good one about a woman hearing footsteps in her house. The house might be haunted. And the finale, it's kind of, it's a little silly as a story. But for some reason, the last paragraph or so just gives me chills. I don't know what it is about it. It just, there's something haunting about that story. I don't know. It's, again, it's very silly in a lot of ways, but I don't know. I really dig it. And this particular book doesn't really have any kind of comedy section to it. The last section kind of is, but not really entirely. It has some moments, like there's one story called Thup. It's like a bunch of peas. And that one, it is what it is. You know, I don't really like the comedy sections of these books. Some of them are okay, like The Viper from the first book. Really cute story. They have some good stories in here that can be kind of comedy based or be a little bit sillier to make kids laugh in the midst of being terrified and traumatized, but it works. I mean, some of it works, most of it works, I'd say, but I don't love it. It's not my favorite part of the book. I think the comedy sections kind of take away how much fun these books are when they're scary, but I think it was kind of a fill-in-the-blank type thing to try to bring some levity to the kids and also to fill in some space on the page. That's what I think, but at least the art's always good. That's always a good thing about it. Let's see. On the Edge is a section of the book that has one of the most infamous stories from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in Alvin Schwartz's career, called Harold, about two guys who abuse a scarecrow that apparently is coming to life. And Harold, of course, was a big center. He's even the cover poster for the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark film. And I love Harold. I think they did him so much justice with the movie. I think that he looked fantastic. I think the way he moved was fantastic. So many great things were done in that film with Harold, and his vengeance was great there. In this story, this is a great example of a story that if you're reading these books to your kids, you might want to make sure they're older, because the ending of Harold is probably one of the most horrific endings to a story I've ever read from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, or any kid's book for that matter. If you never read the original Cinderella story, the original Cinderella, the one that the Disney movie is based on, if you've never read that Grimm's fairy tale story, you have no idea how horrifically grim that story is for kids. I mean, the ending is horrific. I mean, if you haven't heard about that, that's the kind of kid stories we used to tell back in the day. And that's the kind of stuff that these stories feel like, in my opinion. It's a very Grimm's fairy tale, but pretty much just horror, straight out type story that I love to death. I think they're fantastic. I think they bring so much of an atmosphere to these stories. I think the way Schwartz writes them brings them into a real living space. And then Stephen Gamel's art, as I've said in previous two videos for the previous two books, Stephen Gamel's art brings the intrigue to the stories before you even read them, because if you see them on the next page when you're starting a story, but also it kind of solidifies and makes it even more satisfying for the stories to be better with these art. It's the best coupling of art and writing I've ever seen in my life. I'm a big comic book fan too. This is the best, in my opinion, of art from an artist, a really good artist, a very unique artist. I've never seen art done like Stephen Gamel's art. An artist that is amazing compared and compiled with an amazing writer who can really tell a story in a short amount of time. Schwartz is one of my biggest influences, as I've said over and over again here on my channel, for my type of writing, for my type of scary stories. I love his work. I think he is fantastic. He's always been a big figure to me. My first ever book from him was In a Dark, Dark Room, a long, long time ago, when like in elementary school, and it traumatized me. I even own a hardcover copy of that book because I love it so much. One of my favorite books of all time, easily. It's terrifying at times, but Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark really solidified how amazing Schwartz was as a storyteller, and Harold is one of those stories that completely baffles me how these books did not officially get banned in the US because of the ending of that story. It is probably one of the most bloody and horrific stories I've ever heard in my life. For a kid's story, even. Maybe you can argue that it's not, but as a folklore type thing, maybe you would consider that a story for kids. Harold is scary. Don't ever mistreat a scarecrow, and I'll never even look at scarecrows the same after reading this book. I remember the first time I read this story, back when I had my back injury in 2018, I was sitting in this room, laying in my bed, reading this book. And I remember the first time I ever read Harold, I never knew anything about it, had never heard of the story before, never heard my cousins talk about it, the ones who introduced me to scary stories when I was a kid. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I mean not scary stories in general, because I grew up on horror movies. But anyway, they introduced me to these books. I had never heard them talk about Harold the Scarecrow, and that story had me in utter shock the first time I finished it. It was amazing, it was horrific, and it was an amazing message to people who read the book. And mainly kids especially, I guess, if you would say that, about how you treat people. and I love it. I think it's amazing. Really, really great story. Probably my favorite in the entire book, if I had to say. And if I had to make like a top 10 stories list from the Scary Stories Tell in the Dark books, which I may or may not do that at some point. I might. I don't know. If I do, though, Harold's probably going to be like the top 3. I love it. I think it's amazing. Moving along, though, from all my Harold stuff, the next story after Harold is one that I really like, too, called The Dead Hand, about a guy who gets grabbed by a hand at like a hole in the ground or like a pit or something. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read the book. Like I said, it's been about probably 2 months since I read the book again. It's like the 4th time I've read it in like 2 years. But you think I'd have a grasp on a lot of these stories, but some of them just kind of slip your mind because they're so short and they fly by so quick and they're so effective too, one after another. So you kind of have this feeling of being overwhelmed, of being hit over the head so many times with so many great stories. Especially today's era, because you don't really have many good movies or books or anything consistent constantly coming out in series. So anyway, The Dead Hand is really good. The ending is horrific. I mean, again, I don't know how that ended up in a kid's folklore book. It is pretty traumatizing. So again, Scary Stories 3 has not lost its value in trying to be horrifically terrifying for kids and traumatizing, like I said. Let's see. The next book, the next story in this book is called The Wolf Girl. Not the next immediate story, but one of them. And The Wolf Girl is kind of a wild little story about a girl being raised by wolves. And I don't hate that story, but I do like it. I like it, and I don't love it by any means, though. You ever liked a story, you don't love it? That's how I feel about The Wolf Girl. It's a good story, though. Pretty interesting, in my opinion. Really cool little folklore thing. The art was real weird. It's like a wolf body with a girl's face and head. It's kind of like one of those weird things, like in the book of Revelation in the Bible. Talk about the giant locusts with like the human heads. That's some scary stuff. Really scary stuff to think about. And that picture looks and reminds me a lot of that kind of thing. But yeah. Let's see. Five Nightmares is the next section of the book. It's called The Dream, is the first story in here. The Dream, of course, is the big fat lady with the long black hair from the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie. And that thing is terrifying. That art is scarier than in that story, because in the story it's not like describing what that picture Stephen Gammell came up with was. Stephen Gammell, again, adding that art with that terrifying thing. A lot of people remember that art from that story. That terrifying picture of that big fat lady with the long black hair, with that huge smiley face, is one of the scariest pictures in these books, and it absolutely adds a brand new scary layer to that story that Alvin Schwartz wrote. So again, Stephen Gammell made the stories even better sometimes with his art. He almost made them better. That's amazing. How many artists do you know that can do that? For kind of a, I don't want to say a mediocre story, but like a story that's not as good as it could be. Think about that. How much can you contribute if you're an artist out there? Always look at that as your biggest thing. How you could contribute even more to the story and possibly be better than the writer themselves that the kids, the readers, excuse me, are already invested in. How can you improve the story? Take notes from Stephen Gammell if you're an artist out there. Definitely. Let's see. The Red Spot is also in this section of the book, and it's probably going to be the last one that I talk about, as a matter of fact. The Red Spot is absolutely horrific. It is a story about a girl who was asleep one night and a spider came over and bit her on the cheek, and she starts having like a red bump on her face that keeps getting bigger and bigger. Of course, this was in the film as well, which I'm really thankful it was in the film, because it was a really good scary moment for the film and for the book, if you read these stories. If you read this particular story. The Red Spot, I remember this from when I was a kid. I remember reading the story in one of my cousin's books when we were kids, and I remember that story getting to me so badly that, and again, I loved horror at the time, and that story stuck with me my entire life, and I never remembered where I saw it at until I started reading these books again in 2018. I could not believe what I had found with that story being in these books. It was amazing. Really scary stuff. The Red Spot is such a horrific story if you hate spiders. Again, Alvin Schwartz, Stephen Gammell, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This is the third book, Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Give You Chills, or whatever the title was. So great. I could not possibly recommend these books to you enough if you haven't read them before. They're so effective, they're so much fun, they're creepy, they're spooky. They are everything you could possibly want with scary stories, just in general. They have a very campfire-esque feeling to them. So if you want a good book just to take, if you don't know any scary stories and you're going on a camping trip and you want to scare the crap out of each other, take a copy of this book, get the hardcover. It's like, what? It says $20 on the hardcovers. back thing from Barnes & Noble, but still, I don't think I paid that much for this. You could probably find a really used copy for like $4 online without shipping and tax. I'd recommend just getting a copy of this and take it to your campfire thing and scare everybody, because it's great. It's really, really good. Kids will love this, adults will love this, but there is some really frightening stuff if you're getting this edition that has the old Stephen Gammell artwork, because it's creepy. It is straight up creepy, and like I said, it adds sometimes more fear to those already scary stories. So there's some really spooky ones, like this cover right here is called The Hand, or whatever, The Bloody Hand. I don't know. There's stuff like that in here that really gets to me. But there's some really great stories out there from Alvin Schwartz, just in general from his books. There's some really great stories in these 3 books compiled into this big old volume and this hardcover that I love so much. I have 2 copies of these because I love it so much. I could not possibly recommend Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark 3 more to you if you haven't read it before. And again, I just pick up the hardcover, read all 3 of the books back to back, because they all feel the same. They have such a familiarity to each of them, each of the stories, each of the books, the way they're told, the way they're collected. And again, the humorous aspects aren't my favorite parts, but they do feel fine as a little bit of levity to kids. I do understand why they're here, but still, I don't love them as much as the scary, straight-up terrifying stories that have haunted many people their entire life because of this, because these were coming out from the 80s to the 90s. They had a lot of time in between each of these books, which is weird because they're like 100 pages per book, with all the endnotes and everything included into these books, so that's even more interesting. But anyway, Scary Stories 3, what did you guys think about this book? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Is it your favorite of the series? If I had to rank these, I'd probably say the first book is my favorite, then this book, and then the second book. The second book is weaker than the first 2, or, well, the first and the third, but it's certainly not bad. It's certainly not even close to being bad. It has some great stories in there. I get a little confused at times when I talk about the different books. There's certain stories that I know are in certain books, like this one has Harold, for example. I get a little twisted when I think about these stories to try to recommend which book somebody should pick up, so that's why I just tell people to pick up the whole thing. The whole big hardcover here, really good price for all 3 of the books, where you can buy the box set that has all 3 of the individual books in them. Scary Stories 3, what are your thoughts and comments? Put them down below, guys. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. If I had to rate Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark 3, or Scary Stories 3 as it's called, on a 5-star basis, it would easily be a 5 out of 5, and I could not recommend this book enough to you. It is so good. So, so good. I'm so excited from talking about this today, I don't even want to go to work. I just want to stay home and read the book again, after I just read it like a month ago, for the second, or like the 4th time, like I said. I don't know, I adore Alvin Schwartz. I think he's probably one of the most effective, in my lifetime, writers that I've ever seen. It's probably the most effective on my personal writing style, because the dude could tell a story in a really short amount of time in the best possible ways and really stick with you. Really, really stick with you. If you want that kind of tale, pick up these books, all 3 of them. But anyway, what are your thoughts? Put them down below. Thank you for watching, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless you guys today. And by the way, I'll have a couple of other, probably a lot more actually, of things like Goosebumps videos coming up. I know some people really like these videos, I know a lot of people don't. But I do have a lot of these coming up. There's a lot of video content I have coming out this weekend, just because I have so much I've recorded and so much I have to record. So be ready for a flood of videos this weekend. There's a lot of stuff I've been like watching and talking about and stuff. That's things like Goosebumps that I want to discuss. But anyway, what are your thoughts? Put them down below, guys. Thank you for watching. May the Lord Jesus Christ bless you guys today once again, and goodbye.